With me now is the president of the New Tolerance campaign, a man that I've known for a long time, Gregory Angelo. Gregory, good to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, Liz. Great to reconnect with you.
Of course, of course. We go way back. I've interviewed you probably a dozen times at this point. This is a new venture, the New Tolerance campaign. And by the way, for everybody watching, I conduct interviews on a regular basis. And if you want to see more interviews like this, you can join us at lizwheelershow.com/locals for early access to interviews just like this one. This is going to be pretty interesting because Gregory and I have a lot of similar viewpoints, but we also diverge on a couple of topics and diverge in the details, if you will. And I think today is going to be one of those days. Gregory, the New Tolerance campaign published an op-ed recently in the Baltimore Sun about the ongoing human rights crisis in China, specifically regarding the women's professional tennis player Peng Shuai. You say that a diplomatic boycott is enough. Do you think truly that a diplomatic boycott is enough to make a difference in the human rights abuses that China is inflicting on not just the Chinese people, but specific groups and sects, religious sects in their country?
I don't know that a diplomatic boycott is enough, but it's certainly a course of action that's an improvement on doing absolutely nothing. I think right now we have all across the United States and really the world instances where institutions are failing to even raise their voices talking about the human rights abuses that are happening in China, let alone taking action. That op-ed that I wrote in the Baltimore Sun that came out earlier this week was specifically about actions that the Women's Tennis Association took, going far beyond anything like a diplomatic boycott. They're actually cutting off all tournaments in China at a potential loss of tens, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars. And they're doing that in support of one person, Peng Shuai, after she disappeared following allegations of being sexually assaulted by a former senior minister in the CCP. And she had gone missing. And the only instances where people are seeing her are videos and photos released through state media. The WTA, at a time when the National Basketball Association, Major League Baseball, was twisting themselves into contortions not to in any way offend China, the WTA took a stand. And I think, guess what? Courage is contagious when it comes to dealing with China. For so long, we've had institutions, organizations, especially athletic organizations, kowtowing to China at every turn. The WTA took a brave stand at the potential loss of tens of millions of dollars. And what happened shortly thereafter? The Biden administration announced a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics. Other countries announced they'd be joining the United States in a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics.
And I hear what you're saying. I do hear what you're saying. I guess I'm just sitting here thinking about the stories that we've talked about for years now, whether it's, the Uyghurs being sent to internment camps, the organ harvesting that's happening to the Falun Gong, whether it's the Christians being re-educated, whether it's the social credit score, whether it's the forced abortions, the one-child policy, the communism in general, the lack of free speech, all of these horrible human rights abuses that we hear. And I think, okay, so kudos. I agree with you, by the way, on the Women's Tennis Association. That's great. The International Olympic Committee did essentially nothing. The International Tennis Federation did essentially nothing. I don't even think that the Olympics in 2022 should be held in Beijing at all. I think this is actually egregious that the United States is even sending athletes. I feel compassion for the athletes because I know that they've worked their whole lives for this, but sometimes things are greater than individual ambition, and it seems to me that this is the case. Do you think that the United States should even be sending athletes?
I dealt with this back when I was served as the president of an organization, called the Log Cabin Republicans, when there were calls for a full-on boycott of the Olympics in Russia. This is going back probably about a good 6 years or so, or 8 years, following allegations of not just human rights abuses, but outright kidnapping and torture of gay individuals who, were in Russia. At the time, I spoke with a lot of people who were Olympic athletes and people who advised Olympic athletes. And I don't know that, this is me personally speaking, I don't know that we need to penalize athletes for the failures of our institutions, the failures of the IOC, and the failures of our political leaders. But I think if there is anything we can do in the future, it's to take more of a strong stand so that countries that are guilty of egregious human rights abuses do not have the prestige and the privilege of hosting the Olympics and these global games.
Right, and I certainly agree that that would be ideal. if we could avoid even scheduling an Olympics in a country like China when there's such institutional human rights abuses that are being inflicted. Not that it's not institutional in Russia, what you described about gay people being targeted or imprisoned, but certainly the human rights abuses in China on an ongoing basis are institutional. They are Communist Party tactics that are endorsed by the leaders of China. When it comes to the athletes being penalized argument, I fully understand that. I was an athlete. I mean, it's devastating when you have to skip any kind of competition, especially one that it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. And so I do feel tremendous empathy for that. But isn't that the power that these athletes have in their hands? Because one of the most important things to the Chinese Communist Party is to be recognized on the international stage, is not to lose face. And if they were actually to lose face, if they were actually to have planned this Olympics and then the Western world didn't show up, didn't broadcast this, didn't give them any propaganda efforts, didn't recognize them, do you think that that would make a difference in how they behave? China behaves, I mean?
Yeah, I do think it would. But here's the thing. I think what we have to, the groundwork we need to lay in order to make that happen is to really call out the sporting associations that are allowing China to continue to get accolades around the world, rake in hundreds of millions of dollars by hosting events like the Olympics, by engaging in contracts with Major League Baseball and the National Basketball Association. And this is really the work that we're doing at New Tolerance Campaign, which is raising a grassroots army in all 50 states to really stick it to institutions when they don't live up to their stated values. Here's the real hypocrisy that's happening right now. You have Major League Baseball that abandoned the state of Georgia with their All-Star game earlier this year, saying we stand for equality, we stand for diversity, and we won't stand for what they termed a discriminatory voting bill. We can certainly debate the merits of that, and that's, I think, an issue upon which you and I would agree that the fracas around the Georgia voting law early this year was blown completely out of proportion. But at home, while Major League Baseball talks about how much they're standing in support of human rights, equality, the LGBTQ community, and everything else, they're more than happy to jump in bed with China and engage in multi-million-dollar negotiations with them and engage in contracts with them. You have Enes Kanter in the Boston Celtics, who spoke up against human rights abuses in China. China pulled all the Celtics games from broadcasts in their country. And what did the NBA have to say about it? Absolutely nothing. And I think what it's going to take in order to achieve something like a full-on boycott of the Olympics, like you're talking about, or countries standing up together and joining their voices, saying that they're not going to stand for countries like China, who are guilty of, as you pointed out, an egregious list of human rights abuses. It's going to take leaders to stand up against that.
And I agree with you. I want to drop one point in. I want to drop one point in because this is an issue that I truly don't know what the solution is to this part of it, because the Chinese market is what prevents these organizations, the NBA, well, mostly the NBA is what I'm talking about. Disney is another one. From leaving China. They look the other way on the human rights abuses because the Chinese market is a $5.6 trillion market. That is over $100 billion more than the market in the United States. That's the retail sales only, by the way. A retail sale market is $5.6 trillion. So I guess what is the proper way to stop this? I mean, you and I do what we can in a grassroots way, and it's wonderful, and it does make a difference, but there has to be some sort of larger solution, some sort of big picture solution, because we know, I mean, human nature is fallen. People are going to make bad choices, even sinful choices, even evil choices in the interest of greed. I mean, that's what sin is. How do we actually prevent these people or these corporations like the NBA, like Disney, from choosing China over human rights?
Well, I think it's important to remember that China's got its problems too. China has overpopulation problems. China has unrest among its people who are not especially keen on being ruled by a despotic communist party. China loves Western culture, especially pop culture, also Western athletics. So yeah, I think the problem is that for so long, especially athletic associations have felt that there's absolutely nothing you can say against China, otherwise you're completely shut out from that market. But I think the important lesson with what's happened with the Women's Tennis Association here and the bold and strong stand that their CEO, Steve Simon, has taken is that when you show courage against China, when you stand up for human rights, and when you're consistent with your values, China is the country that blinks first. The WTA had to pull its games. It wasn't China that said they were pulling their games. So I think if people show a little courage, a little more gumption, especially the CEOs of major sporting organizations and these sadly increasingly woke corporations that really need to wake up to a consistent application of their values around the world, I think if that happens, you're going to see some movement from China.
I think you're right. I think, like you said, we've seen that from the WTA. Now we just need to see this from every organization. It needs to be a united front against China, and then China can decide if they want to be isolated on their own or if they want to participate in the international community. And if they do, they need to follow international norms and respect human rights. I think the Biden administration shouldn't send U.S. athletes. I don't think any of the Western world should send athletes if China continues their egregious human rights abuses. And like you said, this could have been avoided months ago, a year ago, with the International Olympic Committee saying, nope, we're not going to allow China, because of their human rights abuses, to host this Olympic Games in the first place. Only countries that have not committed these atrocities against their people are eligible to even apply to host that. Gregory Angelo of New Tolerance Campaign, always a pleasure to talk to you, my friend. And anybody viewing this who wants to see interviews just like this, early exclusive access, can join us on the Liz Wheeler Show community on Locals. That's lizwheelershow.com/locals. Join us over there for not only early exclusive access to interviews like this, but a lot of other benefits. Gregory, thank you for joining me.
Thanks very much, Liz. Newtolerance.org if people want to find out more.
If you haven't already, give this video a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button below, and ring the bell to make sure you never miss a video.